Good morning, everyone. I am just putting my camera on so I can introduce myself and welcome you all to the session. My name is Ilona Milner. I am the Planning, Monitoring, and Evaluation Manager at UNICEF in South Africa. I ask yourself on mute.
Sorry, Lana, you're just on mute there as well.
Great, thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. My name is Ilona Milner. I am the Planning, Monitoring, and Evaluation Manager in UNICEF in South Africa. It's great to see so many people joining this session. We will be covering today results-based management, RBM, and M&E fundamentals. And we're not only our South African counterparts and implementing partners, but we would like to welcome the colleagues, government counterparts, as mentioned, implementing partners from Zimbabwe, from Somalia, from Burundi. We also have colleagues from Ghana, Kenya, Lesotho, Malawi, Uganda. So from a wide range of countries in the East and Southern Africa region. So this is really fantastic to see the numbers. I think with that, I'd just like to introduce Jason from our partner organization, Capacitate, that will be hosting the training, or will be doing the training this morning. And I just wanted to flag that this is the first of two trainings that we have. One is obviously this one, and the next one will be focused on tech and digital tools for the M&E space. I think with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jason. I think we have about 4 hours together, and very excited to be part of this. And thank you very much for joining. Jason, over to you.
Thanks, Ilona, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for your time today and for signing up for the workshop. As Ilona said, this is the first of a few workshops that we're going to be running, in addition to the one in September. Hopefully a few more that will come going into next year. Again, focusing on monitoring and evaluation and strengthening the capacity within organizations. So just to start out, a little bit about myself before we start. So as Ilona said, I'm with an organization called Capacitate, and we've been working across the social economy for almost 20 years now, working with organizations, with implementing partners, with funding partners, with development agencies. And really our focus area is on data for development, ICT for development, and then some strategic advisory around program implementation and planning. So I have spent quite a few years working with partners on the ground and also at a funding level, specifically on monitoring and evaluation and using data to better drive the outcomes that we hope to see within the social economy. I've worked with a range of organizations at a board level, but also at an implementation level, and implemented projects across the continent on the ground, specifically focused on monitoring and evaluation, using technology to improve that process, and then also building capacity within organizations. And really our goal is to see how we can strengthen civil society as key implementers and drivers of positive social change. Just to take a step further in terms of what Ilona was saying, the work that we're doing with UNICEF is to support their partners and other organizations across civil society to strengthen their monitoring and evaluation capacity. Within the partner network for UNICEF, we're looking to identify opportunities and needs where we can strengthen that capacity, both in terms of their delivery against their program and project objectives as defined within their project documentation and results matrix, but also to strengthen their ongoing capacity to be able to monitor and evaluate more effectively, and ultimately to drive better results from a delivery point of view. So for us, the focus is, again, not just in strengthening the UNICEF partner network, but also more broadly supporting civil society organizations that could also benefit from workshops such as this and other activities that we run with UNICEF. So in terms of the process that we generally follow, we see monitoring and evaluation as more of a holistic function within the organization, as we look to drive the development of a culture of data-led decision-making. So for us, monitoring and evaluation exists across a number of different areas, both in terms of the financial resourcing, the human resourcing, the organizational resourcing in terms of the processes and structures that are in place to manage it, the technology that we use to manage and coordinate our data and reporting, and then also the governance structures that sit around monitoring and evaluation. So that is increasingly a challenge for organizations as we see constraints around things like PAPIA and more broadly for GDPR. So it's important that we're also able to implement policy and governance structures that will help us to be compliant, certainly as the regulators start to get clear about how they're enforcing the various pieces of legislation. So just to start with today's objectives, what we're hoping to achieve first and foremost is to demystify monitoring and evaluation. Monitoring and evaluation remains a consistent challenge for many organizations. It is, for the most part, a grudge activity. As many of you will know, it's not something that's easily done, and there's a whole range of jargon and concepts that come with monitoring and evaluation. So what we're hoping to do is to start to understand some of those key concepts, and specifically the results-based management approach that all of those concepts fit into. So looking at what monitoring and evaluation is, why it's important, what are the core concepts, and then adopting an approach that speaks to how we implement and use those core concepts. Next, we want to look at how do we undertake the planning of our monitoring and evaluation. As we know, it's important to have a clear plan in place before undertaking something that is usually quite onerous, like monitoring and evaluation. So what we're looking to do is to help you to understand how to better plan the M&E functions within your own organization. And that speaks to, first and foremost, the theory of change. Theory of change is really a key anchor point, not just for monitoring and evaluation, but really as a mechanism for guiding the organization strategically. So we want to be able to leverage things like monitor the theory of change within your M&E structures to anchor the work that you're doing and to better be able to show the results that you're achieving. We'll also look at log frames, which are fairly common across certainly projects and programs, and then also speak to defining indicators and targets and looking at different things like performance indicators and also results indicators. And then finally, we're going to look at how do we action those plans? How do we put those plans into practice? And as I mentioned, we're looking to drive a culture of data-led decision-making. So that data-led decision-making is something that extends across the organization. It isn't just constrained to the function of the M&E officer or the M&E lead. So we want to see how we're implementing monitoring and evaluation across the organization so that the data is something, the data and the insights are things that we're applying in our day-to-day work, not just for the purposes of reporting to our funding partners. So that means looking at the M&E plan, making sure that we have the resourcing, because it's not a cheap undertaking. We have the necessary policies in place. And then, as I said, leveraging that M&E both for compliance in terms of meeting the objectives and reporting requirements for our funding partners, but also how we're leveraging monitoring and evaluation to drive the visibility and the credibility of the organization that we represent. So that's in a nutshell is what we're hoping to achieve today. We'll have a few breaks throughout the day. So just to give you an idea of what we're the schedule that we're going to be running off of. So as I said, the first session we'll run for 60 minutes. We're going to run a number of Q&A sessions, so you'll have time to ask questions as we go along. I do ask that you just raise your hand, and we can try and address those questions as we're going. And make sure that everybody has a chance to ask any questions that they may have. Just to note as well that this is an introductory workshop. Some of the concepts are fairly detailed and intensive, so we won't go into as much detail in all of the concepts. Certainly we could spend a few hours on things like theory of change and indicators, and even the broader RBM approach. In terms of the tools for M&E, we'll speak to those as well and looking at some of the technology, but we'll pick up the discussion around technology, both for the M&E function, but also more broadly in terms of project or program implementation, looking at some of the technology options that we have available. So that's really the schedule for today. And as I said, we'll have some time during the sessions for some Q&A and also for some coffee breaks and some comfort breaks. As you know, it's important that we get our caffeine fixed during the day. So I'm going to start off, I think, just by asking everyone if you do have specific questions, some burning issues. We did have that as part of the registration, but if you do have key issues that you're looking to resolve or questions that you have, ask that you post those in the chat or in the Q&A. So we have opened up a Q&A there, so you can post your questions. And then when we get to Q&A, we can also try to resolve them as far as possible. Okay. So I'm going to get fairly tired of looking at myself, but I'll move between the videos presenting as well as the slides as we're going. So if there are no immediate and specific questions or concerns, I did see Alona respond to the question around the slides. We'll certainly share those slides and the recording with everyone that's registered on the session. And then, as we said, we'll also follow up with information about any other sessions that we're running as part of the UNICEF project, but also any other sessions that we run more broadly across civil society. Great. Were there any specific questions? Great. So let's then dive in, starting with that demystification of monitoring and evaluation. As I said, I've been working within M&E for quite some time now. If it's any comfort to anyone, it's never an easy and fun undertaking. It is always a fairly onerous task and a difficult one, but an extremely important. And as we'll keep emphasizing throughout the session, we want to see monitoring and evaluation not just as a compliance or obligatory reporting function, but really something that can help strengthen the organization, can help improve results, and help guide the decisions that we're making. So monitoring and evaluation should be something that runs throughout the organization at all levels of management and also program implementation. But ultimately, remember that when we talk about monitoring and evaluation, it's because it's so easy to get overwhelmed by all of the jargon. We have a lot of different terms and phrases and concepts. Ultimately, monitoring and evaluation, to a greater or lesser extent, is common sense. Okay, so we want to be able to track the work that we're doing. We want to know, firstly, if we're doing what we say we're doing, and then also, quite importantly, whether or not that actually means anything. So just checking the mute sections. So starting off then, if we look at monitoring and evaluation, which are often clustered together, so it is a process of continued gathering of information and analysis. And ultimately what we're wanting to do is to figure out whether or not we've made any progress. Does it mean anything? Yes, we want to track whether or not we did the things that we said we were going to do. But also what we're wanting to do is we're wanting to track the progress that we're making. So have we achieved what we hope to achieve? But also in terms of monitoring and evaluation, we need to start up by knowing whether or not what we're doing will actually achieve the things that we hope it will. So the insights that we gather from monitoring and evaluation should really inform both operational and strategic decisions. And this is really why we've seen the progression in terms of the use of technology within M&E, because traditionally there is such a lag time in gathering and managing the data around monitoring and evaluation. It can often only inform strategic decisions after the fact. What technology has done is accelerated the visibility that we can achieve early on within a program implementation. And that gives us the opportunity to achieve greater operational visibility. And that means knowing what's happening today or at this particular moment in time, not necessarily what's happened already that we can't even do anything about. So really what we hope monitoring and evaluation will do is to give us that visibility to make better operational decisions on an ongoing basis, but also to guide our strategy. And guiding that strategy means the program design, the partners that we're working with, and what sort of results are achievable through the programs that we're implementing. So if we break up the function of monitoring and evaluation, the starting point is always around the data. So the monitoring function is looking at the data that's collected. And this ultimately should be informed by the indicators that we've defined and determined through our theory of change and also incorporating our logical framework. And looking at the monitoring process in itself, there are different kinds of monitoring. So if we look at program monitoring, we may be monitoring implementation. And this is the visibility from an operational point of view that we're talking about. So if we're monitoring our day-to-day activities, we want to know what is happening on the ground. So that implementation monitoring gives us visibility of the operations that we're undertaking, primarily in terms of the inputs and activities, but also to some extent the outputs. So those outputs being the things that have happened as a result directly of the activities that we've done. When we look at results monitoring, this is where things get a little more complex. And here we're looking at our outcomes, so the change that we've achieved, and also our contribution towards broader impact. So that impact discussion we'll have a little bit later as well, because it is quite a difficult one. And because we work in such complex settings, being able to reliably claim impact is often disingenuous. So we always talk about our contribution towards impact objectives. And that really looking to consider the functions of a range of different factors that contribute either positively or negatively towards us realizing our objectives. So then moving on to the evaluation component. So this is where we're looking to take the data that we've collected and draw insights from that data. So again, just looking at whether or not, firstly, the right thing is being done. Is it being done well? Are there better ways of doing it? So we're looking to understand how the result has been achieved, to document any good practices and results, and for us to learn from the experience. Now, within the function of evaluation, often this is guided by things like the OECD criteria, where we talk about, firstly, the relevance of the work that we're doing, the efficiency of the work that we're doing, the effectiveness of the work that we're doing, and also the sustainability of the work that we're doing. And generally, when you encounter third-party evaluations or external evaluations, most evaluators would draw on these components when completing an external evaluation of your organization or particular programs that you're running. There is, of course, a distinct difference between assessment and evaluation. Generally, assessment is ongoing and focused at an individual level, whereas evaluation is applied against those standards that I referenced before in terms of the OECD. But really, both require those core data components through monitoring. So we need to be able to incorporate the data to track our performance and show what progress is being made. So then, just looking at the difference or the definitions of evaluation and monitoring. Evaluation is not necessarily on an ongoing basis, but there we're looking to understand the data that we've collected through our monitoring. It is a systematic process, which means we follow a structure in how we're collecting that data. Again, that should be informed by things like our logical frameworks and also our theory of change. We're wanting to track key performance, both in terms of our activities as well as in terms of the results that we're achieving. And it also gives us, as I said, that operational visibility so that we can make those corrective decisions or that corrective action to ensure that the program is being delivered as efficiently as possible. At an evaluation level, we're looking to determine really the effectiveness of the work that we're doing. So we need both of those components in order to be able to manage the program implementation and to ensure that it's achieving the results that we had anticipated or hoped. And combining those two really forms the foundation of what is the results-based management approach. But we'll get to that in a little bit later. So the question around why we should bother, coming back to those OECD criteria. So relevance, sufficiency, effectiveness, sustainability, and value. So from a relevance point of view, monitoring and evaluation will help us to understand if the work that we're doing is the right kind of work. So if we're implementing, for example, a nutrition program where there are no issues around nutrition, we're obviously wasting our time and money. From an efficiency point of view, we want to make sure that we're realizing as much value as possible when we are implementing our particular programs. So it is important for us to then track how efficient we're being, how efficiently we're using the resources that we have available to deliver the work that we're doing. Effectiveness, as I said, this links closely to evaluation. And here we're talking about whether or not it makes any difference. So is the work that we're doing actually driving change? If we're just completing activities and there is no change that's being realized, then we have to start to ask ourselves the question, why are we doing it and why are we spending our time and effort in completing these activities if we're not seeing any change? Then sustainability, this speaks to both the financial resourcing, but also in terms of the results that are achieved. Generally, the results are going to require ongoing resources. So we want to be able to ensure that we can show a return on investment when it comes to articulating the work that's being done to our investors and our partners. And that will ultimately give us the basis for motivating for continued investment, but also then to show why the organization in itself exists. And then finally, looking at understanding the value of what we're doing. So this speaks to both the impact and the outcomes. So the positive difference that as an organization that's implementing programs, we're able to have within the communities in which we're working. Okay, as I said, this is a a criteria that's used within OECD, OECD being a global agency that has established and defined these criteria, and as I said, mostly applied by third-party evaluators when undertaking any evaluations of programs or projects with partners. So when looking at the monitoring and evaluation function, it is a complex undertaking. It's not something that is easy and certainly not cheap to do. So generally we need, in order to navigate these things, we need the resources, we need the tools, we need the people, and we need the structure and planning in order to navigate what can be a fairly treacherous journey. And that's really what we want to use to guide us in understanding who our stakeholders are, what are the risks involved with the work that we're doing, how do we mitigate, also considering what is the context in which we're working. So at a program level, as we're starting to implement and to address key social issues, the M&E will also help us to guide us in mapping that landscape and understanding all of these different factors as we look to achieve the objectives that we hope. So firstly, understanding the problem and then navigating through those challenges to try and address or contribute towards a positive change or resolving that particular challenge. So M&E gives us the mechanisms to try and make sense of the landscape that we're working in and the work that we're doing and the results that we're able to achieve. So moving then on to the core concepts that we have within M&E. In every project, we're going to have a range of stakeholders, and really stakeholders are anybody that cares about what we're doing, and often people that don't care about what we're doing. So this includes categories like the beneficiaries that we serve, and the clients that we serve, the partners that we work with, the funders that support us, as well as staff within the organization, board members as well. So there can be a range of stakeholders. There are a number of processes to map out stakeholders that often forms a part of the monitoring and evaluation process. But really the stakeholders are the ones that we want to provide the insights to so that they can make better decisions in terms of the implementation. Inputs, those are the things that we use to do the stuff that we do. Okay, this includes the resources that we need for monitoring and evaluation. And we'll touch on this a bit when we get to the financial resourcing for monitoring and evaluation, but important to recognize that the inputs, that things like funding and human resources and ideas and IP is really the driver for the activities, stuff that we do. So the activities are those things that you're actively engaged with on a day-to-day basis as part of the program. This might be a training activity, for example. The outputs are those things that happen directly as a result of our activities. So, for example, in the case of a training activity, the output of that would be the number of people that attended that training activity. Then when we get to the outcomes, we're starting to ask the question of, so what? So what does it mean that we've done these activities and we've had people attend the training? An example of this would be, what is the change in their understanding of a concept that we delivered during the training? So the outcomes are generally longer term. So it's not a direct result that we can track in terms of things like attendance. We would need to incorporate things like a pre-test or a post-test to test the improvement in knowledge. And often these outcome level data are more difficult and often more costly for us to develop. When it comes to impact or our goals, this is the broader change that we're seeing happen. So again, it's a longer term view. Impact definition, and you'll hear the term impact used across the board when it comes to the development sector. Impact's attribution is a very difficult claim to make. So when it comes to impact, what we generally speak about is our contribution towards broader impact. Sure, I just see someone asked to turn off the camera. No problem. Let me turn that off. There we go. So as I said, it's contribution towards broader impact. And the reason that I say that is really speaking to the complexity of the context in which we work. So the context in which we work, there are a whole range of factors that can positively contribute towards realizing a particular goal, but also can have a negative impact on the work that we're doing. So in order for us to reliably claim that value that is delivered in terms of driving a positive change at the impact level, there are too many variables that contribute towards that result. So generally, when we speak about impact, we talk about a contribution towards that achievement, especially as you start to extend into a macro level where you're looking at shifting broader indicators, things like unemployment. The best that we can do as implementing partners is make a positive contribution towards the probability of success. So the cluster of impact and outcomes is generally where we would discuss things like results. So results really include both the outcomes and the broader impact. It just gives us a broader range of classification to incorporate both our contribution towards that macro objective, as well as the change that we're able to reliably claim through attribution. And again, if we're able to do a pre-test or a post-test, and effectively check what the difference is in terms of understanding or knowledge. We can then reliably claim that as an outcome, but also we know that, for example, the training that we've provided increases the probability of success, for example, for a young person to find a job. So if they've completed that training, their probability of success in finding employment has increased, although we may not be able to claim that directly. As we start to look at how we do that attribution and how we claim and measure, the indicators are really the critical anchor point for us to be able to follow the outcomes, the outputs, and also the broader impact that we're having. So the indicators allow us to track the work that we've done and what change we've realized. Underpinning those indicators are, of course, the data. So indicators are made up of different data sets, and generally those indicators can be at a performance level, an output level, or an outcome level. So for example, at a performance level, we might look at the training sessions, what you're doing, and the output might be the number of people that attended, and the outcome indicators would then be the improvement or the change in understanding or knowledge that's been achieved through that particular workshop. As I said, the data is what we draw on from a monitoring point of view. So the data is assimilated through the monitoring process. Now, the point of comparison is where the baseline comes in. So there were a few questions around baselines. Baselines give us a reference point to know where we started from. So where were we when we started the program, and what did the data look like after the program? So the baseline gives us an anchor reference point for our indicators and for our data. Generally, baselines are quite difficult to achieve, especially if it's a new project or implementation. And also if we have to collect the data ourselves for the baseline, that can also be quite an expensive and time-consuming undertaking. The context is really where we're working. So important to understand the context in which we're working so that we can, of course, adapt the program that we're implementing, but also importantly, so that we can start to understand, firstly, the assumptions that we're making about the results that we hope to see, but also as we look at the potential risks and the factors that might contribute either positively or negatively towards the work that we're doing. Then also moving on to targets. So targets, these are what we set when we're looking at what we hope to achieve. We'll spend some time on targets in a little bit because those are really important as we start to establish what we want to achieve. Without targets, we don't have really a strong motivation for delivery. We need to have something to aim at, and we also need to have a shared understanding and be able to manage the expectations of our partners in terms of what we hope to achieve. Without our timelines, those targets can be fairly meaningless. So we want to set a time frame as to how long it's going to take us to get these things done. And then coming back to the items that we mentioned before, the relevance, is this the right thing to do? The efficiency, how well are we doing the things that we're doing with the resources that we have? Effectiveness, what difference does this make? So that we want to know whether or not we're achieving the change that we hope to. Then sustainability, is the change lasting, and are we able to maintain the work that we're doing? The assumptions, these are the things that we want to understand when we're compiling the program and when we're implementing the program. What are we assuming in the work that we're doing? We're assuming that if we run a training program, for example, that the attendees of that training program will learn, will listen, will pay attention, and will improve their knowledge. So those are some of the things that we would need to map out certainly when it comes to defining our theory of change. Risks, those are the things that can go wrong. Mitigations, how do we prevent those things that might go wrong from happening, or how do we reduce the impact of those things in terms of our program implementation? Constraints, certainly finance is always one of those. What are the constraints that might prevent us from realizing the results that we hope to achieve? So within the development context, yes, money is always a key constraint, but there may be other legislative constraints. There may be macro factors that constrain our implementation or the results that we can achieve. So it's important to recognize those, and certainly as you're starting to plan your monitoring and evaluation and develop your documentation around monitoring and evaluation, is to consider those constraints when engaging with implementing partners or funders as well. A log frame, we'll speak to it certainly in some detail. This is really a planning framework for your monitoring and evaluation. The theory of change, and this is a visual map for your results. But also, as I said, the theory of change provides an anchor point to guide both your monitoring and evaluation, but also to help you articulate your broader organizational strategy, as well as individual program strategies. And we'll speak to this in a bit more detail once we get to that section. And then quite importantly, the results-based management approach. So this is really an approach to how you're working from an implementation point of view. Again, using your results and your objectives to guide the work that you're doing, but also to ensure that you're guided by the data that you're collecting and the insights that you're able to draw through your monitoring and evaluation process. So the RBM approach is really looking at being driven by data. So incorporating monitoring and evaluation to guide the work that we're doing, to make sure that we're making decisions that give us the best efficiency, that realize the best possible results, and also ensure that there's consistent accountability. So we want to use this approach that incorporates things like a theory of change, that incorporates clearly defined indicators and a logical framework to guide the work that we're doing, and really applying a structured approach to the work that we're doing, using the data for our planning, incorporating that into our monitoring and evaluation, and tracking the work that we're doing so that we're able to adapt and deliver the best possible results on an ongoing basis. And really the process is something that is applied across the organization. As I mentioned earlier, it's not just about the monitoring and evaluation officer that is responsible for managing the processes within the organization, but really it's something that incorporates the entire organization. So the focus is on outcomes. So rather than emphasizing just the activities, the work that we're doing, the focus is on what is the change that we're looking to see. And it incorporates things like the logical framework, where we're applying that linear approach and defining our impact, our inputs and our activities and our outputs and outcomes, as well as incorporating those performance indicators to be able to track the work that we're doing. So it's bringing in that continuous monitoring and feedback so that we're informing the decisions that we're making. We're drawing on insights through evaluation to understand the data that we're collecting and what the monitoring is telling us. We're able to then improve our accountability and transparency so that the resources are being used as efficiently as possible. That accountability both to internal and external stakeholders, so that we're able to be accountable to each other as members of an organization, but also to other stakeholders like board members, and certainly to our funders as well. The RBM approach is also focused on that continuous learning and improvement. So we want to make sure that we're using the data that we have to better deliver the work that we're doing, to better engage with our stakeholders, and certainly to keep adapting and improving the programs that we use. One of the key challenges with traditional development programs is that there's very little innovation around the implementations that we're driving. And one of the reasons for this is the lack of effective data and effective insights that should be driving adaptation and evolution of particular programs. And RBM can help us to drive that that process of learning and adaptation. So really the RBM approach looks at a continuous cycle of planning, implementation, monitoring, evaluation, reporting, learning and adaptation, and then again reverting back to planning. So it's a management process that is an ongoing one. So it's not a once-off. You don't do it once and then you're done. It's a perpetual cycle of planning, implementation, monitoring, evaluation, reporting, and learning. So when we're planning, we want to understand what results we want to achieve and how are we going to achieve it, what do we need to achieve it, when are we going to do it, how are we going to measure it, what are our assumptions, what are the risks, what are the constraints. So all of the stuff that we would need to do as we're busy with that implementation. When we implement, we then want to be able to monitor and track the work that we're doing. And as I mentioned in terms of the baseline, for that we may need data to inform the starting point. So the baseline to understand what was the starting point before we implemented, and then what does the data look like after the implementation. And that's where we feed into the evaluation process. So at the point of evaluation, we want to analyze the data, both in terms of tracking how efficient we were or how efficient we are, but also in understanding what the implementation actually meant. Did we drive the change that we wanted to? The reporting function is to ensure that we're able to communicate effectively with our stakeholders, both in terms of improving the efficiency, also from a compliance point of view and meeting our reporting obligations. So we want to share those insights with relevant stakeholders. And then once we've communicated that both internally and externally, we then want to learn and adapt. So interpreting the information that we've drawn from the evaluation, what the insights have shown us, we then want to say, great, now we understand this work that we did. Did it make any difference? Do we need to change the program? Where are there opportunities for us to improve the efficiency or effectiveness of the work that we're doing? This reflection is, in many cases, something that is not undertaken by organizations as they're implementing, and it is an opportunity that is lost. It is an opportunity both for driving greater efficiency and effectiveness in the work that you're doing, but also an opportunity to innovate. And this reflection and adaptation process is really a critical driver of innovation. So taking the data and understanding the work that's been done, and then looking at asking the question of, can we do it better? Is there a better way to do the work that we're doing? If we're seeing the changes that we anticipate, fantastic. It validates the work that we're doing. It shows that the program is relevant, but we should always be asking at the point of learning and adaptation is there a way to do this better? And again, it is not something that's generally undertaken by many organizations because it involves risk. Changing anything involves some new risk. But in order for us to drive innovation, to improve efficiency and effectiveness, we should all be willing to undertake some level of risk in testing new approaches, in testing changes in adaptation or evolution of programs, so that we can hopefully improve the outcomes that we're looking to achieve. But as I said, this is generally something that is a luxury for many organizations. And certainly from a funder's perspective, it is an agenda that we need to try and drive consistently, so that funders are also able to walk that journey with us to drive some level of innovation off of our learnings and our data that can help us to do the work better, to achieve better results, to maximize the outcomes that we're able to realize across the board. So just a keynote to consider: what are the opportunities for us to drive innovation using the data, using a results-based management approach to achieve better results and to deliver greater value to the communities that we serve. So at this stage, I'm just going to pause. It has been a fairly significant dump of data already. So I just wanted to take this opportunity to pause for everyone to firstly to take a comfort break, and then we can move on to that secondary objective. So we'll just take a 5-minute break now, so that everyone can take a comfort break or get a refresher on coffee. And then what we'll do is come back and then start off with some questions, and then dig into the next objective that we're looking to when it comes to planning our activity. So if everyone wants to then take a break, we'll reconvene. I think we'll make it at 5 minutes to 11, and then we'll run through some Q&A. What we'll try and do is, as far as possible, where we're able to make up some time, it'll give us some more time towards the end of the session to answer more specific questions. But if you could all be back by 5 minutes to 11, we can then dig into some questions, and then move on to the objective number 2. Thanks, everyone.
عشان comfort break بنعمل
Hi, Chris. Can you please mute your video? Thank you.
Jason, can we just ask the colleagues, Christoph, if you can hear us, can you please turn the video off? Yeah. Christoph?
Thanks, Elena. Yes.
I'm not sure he is with us because his video is still on. Sorry, Christoph, can you hear me? Yeah. I'm not sure how to do it on the admin side, Jason. Is it possible for you to close this video?
I can't from this side, unfortunately.
Yeah, I can't seem to do it either. Second. Okay. Because I don't think he was monitoring the chat because the colleagues were also asking him.
Oh, there we go.
Oh, great. Thank you so much. Okay, over to you, Jason.
Great. Thanks, everyone. We're back. Christopher, if you want to. See if we can do that. Maybe that will help. Christopher, you want to try and just turn off your camera. In the top right there, you can just disable your camera. Okay. Just while we're busy sorting out that, can just stop sharing for now. So I see there were a few questions, and Ilona has helped to consolidate some of those. So I think just to take a slight step back, as we're talking about results-based management. Okay, so that RBM is an approach that we follow. And the RBM incorporates things like a theory of change and a logical framework that also then uses indicators to track our progress. So the RBM approach is an organizational approach to the way that we deliver the programs and also how we're able to manage and our results that are being achieved. So it isn't action research because it is a management approach. It's looking at how we're using data to more effectively implement the programs that we're working on. Also then looking at those definitions in terms of output and outcomes and also impact. So as I said, generally results would incorporate both your outputs and also your outcomes and also potentially your impact. But as I said, for the most part, it's not a good idea at any stage to speak about impact at an organizational level because it is so difficult to claim that attribution. So as an organization, for the most part, you cannot reliably claim change at a impact level because of the variables that contribute towards those shifts. And generally that is reflected at a macro level, either, for example, at an SDG level, certainly that's where UNICEF speaks about impact, or at an NDP level from a country perspective. So in terms of realizing change across a board and national development plan, that's where we would be speaking about impact. So changing levels of unemployment, as I said, those would be an impact level. But as an organization that's driving skills development or training for young people, we can't reliably claim that impact level shift. But what we can do is we can claim a contribution towards that shift. So if we're driving a lot more training broadly across the sector, we're likely to see that shift in unemployment. But it's not something that we can reliably claim as an impact of the organization because there are so many variables that contribute towards that level of data. So generally at an organizational level, we'll be focused on the output. So for example, in training, we'll have how many people attended the training. And generally, that's where many funders will stop at their level of tracking to ensure that the work is being done at an activity level, that then evidenced through the outputs, so the number of people that attended the training session, for example. But what we also want to show is we want to know what that means. So when we speak about the outcome level data, we're then looking at what is the change that we're seeing. So we're asking the question, so what? If 50 people attended a training and the training was rubbish and nobody learned anything, then the outcome was largely irrelevant. So yes, we want to count the number of people that attend a particular training session, but we also want to ensure that the change is realized through that activity. So that outcome level data gives us a view of both the positive change from an effectiveness point of view, but also from an efficiency point of view in terms of the work that's being delivered. So the activity, what is the quality of the activity? If we're delivering rubbish training, then obviously we're not having the desired, we're not achieving the desired results. So we're burning resources and time, but we're not actually driving a positive change. So I saw some additional questions. Sorry, the slides aren't moving yet. I'm just speaking through some of the questions. And then also just as a specific example, especially for those UNICEF partners, as we look at the results matrix that's part of the program documentation. So as partners are onboarded as UNICEF partners, the results matrix is where we're going to be defining primarily the output level of data in terms of what's going to be done, the work that's going to be delivered through the contract. But ideally, we also want to start extending beyond that at an organizational level to start to qualify the work that's being done in terms of the qualitative data. So what is the change that's being realized? And often, as I said, for example, in training, we would have a pre and a post test to show what that positive change looks like. Okay, I just wanted to open it up to see if there are any specific questions at this stage. So if you have a specific question, then you want to raise your hand and we can try and answer that. As I said, we can spend a lot of time digging into specific individual elements, but we want to provide as much as possible a broad overview with some understanding, and then we can always dig into those. Some of those we'll be dealing with a bit later on as well. I did see a hand go up and down. If you want to unmute, Nadine. You want to go ahead?
Hi, Jason. Yes, I know it's a technical question, but around the matter of impact, and I agree with you 100% about contribution to impact. It's a technical thing about when one's drafting such reports usually. So I've been guided to call it an impact study report, and now people have been toying with the phrase efficacy report, and in the spirit of authenticity, what would you suggest one actually names such a thing? So a progress report just sounds too fluffy, because this is, I'm compiling a report at the end of this year, which is the result of 4 years of interventions with schools. And so I want it to be taken seriously, but I also don't want to be claiming more than we actually should be. Your thoughts?
Yeah, so generally we would speak about a results report, because that incorporates both your output and your outcome level data. Look, to be honest, I think when I'm working with implementation partners, we aggressively try to claim as much value as possible. So a lot of that is about firstly understanding the value that you're delivering and the results that you're achieving, but also then following what those results mean. So as we said, as an organization, for example, that works with, let's start at a really low level, we start at school nutrition. So as an organization that gives breakfast to children at school, the focus is obviously on those nutritional outcomes. So things like stunting, improvements in BMI, and things like that. However, there is secondary value to that, and more at an outcome level, it might be things like attendance. So looking at the improvement in attendance because there's breakfast available. Also, we would be looking to track things like the improvement in performance at school, because we know that the research tells us that children that have a healthy breakfast are more likely, firstly, to attend school, but also to be able to concentrate when they are at school. And generally at an outcome level, that's as much as we could reliably attribute to the work that we're doing. Obviously, there are some factors that would contribute positively and negatively to that, which is why within a report like yours, you would want to list those assumptions, the assumption being that if we give you breakfast, you'll attend school and achieve better results, but also those factors that might negatively influence those anticipated outcomes. So things like the quality of teaching or infrastructure that's available. So those are within a report function where we want to list those factors that might positively or negatively contribute towards the results that are being realized. But if we take it a step further and we say, well, what does it mean if a child is able to attend school, receives a healthy breakfast and is in a better state of health, is able to perform at school? Well, in essence, we can extend that further in providing or claiming some level of contribution towards broader educational outcomes. So we know that if a child is receiving a healthy breakfast, they're attending school, they're performing at school, it's going to impact on their relationships at home. It's also going to impact on their likelihood of staying in school. It's going to provide them with a good foundation for progressing in school. So we could also then say that we're contributing towards broader educational outcomes as those children progress into high school and ultimately into post-secondary education and training, and then eventually into finding employment. So that thread extends from the direct point of engagement, but obviously the attribution becomes lighter and lighter the further away and the longer along we're looking to track. So within, and we'll speak to that when it comes to theory of change as well, but ultimately the reason that we're working, for example, with children and providing nutrition or improved education outcomes is that it provides a foundation for their later years. And often from an impact point of view, you are looking at years of tracking in order to show change, which is why it is so difficult to do. And things like longitudinal studies are extremely expensive and can take a lot of time. So I don't know if that answers your question, but generally I would frame that report as a function of articulating results. But certainly you want to show, based on secondary research that is available, we want to show that because we're working with children at a young age, we're supporting their nutrition, it has an effect on their performance at school, and that performance at school then has an effect on the rest of their career and progression into work. But obviously we can't claim all the credit for that, but we want to certainly be able to validate the work that's being done by the organization and also the importance of it. And certainly when we look at evaluating different kinds of programs, the interventions that are required at an early age generally are less intensive or less resource intensive and have the greatest effect. If we talk about early childhood development or early child nutrition, we certainly see that. And as you extend later on in terms of intervention, it becomes more expensive and time consuming to intervene or to shift the trajectory of a young person, for example, if they have had poor nutrition, if they haven't had the benefit of good education at an early age at a primary level, and certainly at a secondary level. So certainly we want to be able to articulate when presenting any reports to stakeholders as much value as possible, again, to firstly motivate for ongoing funding, but also to validate the justification for the program design as a whole. Thanks. Dennis, you had a question as well?
Yes, thank you, Jason. I have two questions. One is about, I wanted you to talk about results. Is there something called results-based monitoring and results-based evaluation? And what do we look at in those two aspects in relation to RBM, results-based management? And then the second question is on the results chain in relation to indicators. I know in my basic M&E that results chain includes inputs, outputs, outcomes, and impact. Now my question is, you talked about indicators. What is puzzling my mind is the issue of impact indicators. How do we measure impact if we don't have indicators at impact level? Because you looked at outcome indicators. Thank you.
Thanks, Dennis. So generally, I think you said results-based monitoring. So there's a lot of I suppose adaptation around the phrasing. So results-based monitoring, results-based management, a lot of those are used interchangeably. Results-based approach, RBA, so you can have RBA, RBM, but generally the process is, or the function is much the same. Results-based monitoring would be a part of results-based management, as you would need to do the monitoring in order to drive the management function. But the approach is really a process of management. How are we managing the work that we're doing, and incorporating these functions of monitoring and evaluation within that approach as a whole? So the results-based management approach incorporates all of these monitoring and evaluation tools so that we can more effectively implement and we can show the results that are being achieved, but also so that we can inform the decisions that we're making around the implementation, and ideally adapting and improving the work that we're doing. Sorry, I just saw a question there around the performance versus results indicators. And we'll spend some time on results in a little bit, but performance indicators, those are the things that we're tracking based on the activities that we're busy with. So how are we performing? So in terms of running activities, are we running, how many activities are we running, how many people are attending those activities? So we're tracking the performance of our activities. So really it speaks to the efficiency, whereas results is talking about the effectiveness of the work that we're doing. So what is the difference that we're making? What's the change that we're driving? There can be some overlap in terms of the performance and results as we look at kind of that line between outputs and also outcomes. But generally performance indicators are providing operational visibility to give us a view of what's happening on a day-to-day basis within the organization, within the programs that are being delivered. The results indicators are really looking at, are we achieving what we wanted to achieve? And as I said, results incorporating both outputs and the outcomes. So again, how many people are we working with? And also what is the change that we're seeing as a result of the work that we're doing? So does that clarify? Dennis, does that also answer your question?
Yes, specifically I wanted to talk about, there are things like impact indicators, different from outcome indicators.
Yeah, yes. So there definitely are impact indicators. And as I said, generally you would see things like within UNICEF, those country priorities would have specific indicators. SDGs would have specific indicators. And even things like the National Development Plan would also have specific indicators. And those would be things like level of unemployment or rates of gender-based violence. So those indicators are generally based on collective big data and happening at more of a macro level. As I said, because they're tracked over a longer period of time, generally they're managed through collective structures like the Department of Monitoring and Evaluation, or the various education departments or similar, or bodies like the UN through the SDGs. And again, those are consolidations of a whole range of different data sets. And this is why as organizations, we generally are not in a position to be able to validate the work that we're doing at an impact level. because there are so many other factors that are contributing towards shifts in those indicators. And often those shifts are as a result of other macro factors, for example, global economic recession. So that's going to drive levels of unemployment, regardless of how fantastic we're able to, or fantastic the training is that we're providing. And those indicators are important for us to consider as we look at things like our theory of change, and we'll come to that shortly, because we want to show where we're contributing and where we're aligning with those broader macro objectives from a societal point of view or from a community point of view. So indicators would generally be defined at an impact level as those percentage shifts in kind of key societal factors, things like unemployment, levels of poverty, standards of education, gender-based violence, incidence of HIV infection. So it is generally a combination of different data sets supplied by a range of different partners. Just to note, and we will touch on this a little bit later as well, organizations like Statistics South Africa are busy working on integrated indicator frameworks. And because there are so many different indicators across countries and also in country, it does get confusing for many to look at how do we aligning the work that we're doing within a broader indicator framework. And those are very useful for us to be able to classify the work that we're doing. Perhaps just to take the UNICEF context as an example, within UNICEF you have key country priorities and then also different sections within UNICEF that focus, for example, on education. And within education, there will be a set of core indicators. And ideally, what we want to do is we want to show that the work that we're doing aligns with one of those broader impact indicators. Because, as we said, our role is to contribute to increasing the probability of success at that level. Yes, we can't claim all of that attribution, but certainly we can show how we're contributing to that. And again, that process of alignment is drawing on how was the program designed? Was the program designed to feed into those broader issues that we're seeing? And a lot of this is quite intuitive. As I said, monitoring and evaluation is often a matter of common sense. So these are things that we often know already. We're just not necessarily articulating it through our monitoring and evaluation framework or our monitoring and evaluation structures. Yeah, and if there are any additional questions, and then we'll start to move on to the next section. Okay, oh, sorry, just before I forget, objectives. So again, objectives, those are not necessarily RBM specific definitions, but we may use that within the organization, our objective in terms of our vision and mission as an organization. And often in terms of programmatic delivery, those objectives could also then sit potentially at an impact level. But the usage of things like our objectives is more of a colloquial term rather than a specific M&E term or an RBM term. But the structures that we're looking to use here is to try and get some standardization. The interchangeable use of things like log frame theory of change, impacts, objectives, goals, does make it tricky to navigate. So we want to use some of the structures that exist already. And certainly we do have some templates that are hosted on the UNICEF partner site that we'll refer you to at the end of the session, giving you some templates and some additional resourcing to read into those definitions and also the use of those terms. But ideally, what we want to do is to try and, as far as possible, standardize and manage the understanding of those core concepts with all of our stakeholders. So again, the reason that we use these terms is because they're being used by the sector more broadly, both in terms of consultants doing evaluations, but also by organizations internally in terms of their monitoring and evaluation. So ideally, we want to try and standardize it so that we have a common understanding of what something means. Okay. So if there are no further questions, then we can move on to the planning component. So for that planning component, what we're looking to do here is, again, as part of that RBM process, is look at what are we going to do. And certainly for me, one of the key starting points is always the theory of change. The theory of change is not just an M&E function. It's something that helps us to better manage the strategy and the objectives of the organization as a whole. We want to make sure that we're using our theory of change to anchor the organization in the programs that it's doing. And the reason I say anchor is because as organizations that have infrastructure, we have people, we have facilities that are carrying rolling costs, there is always pressure to move outside of the work or our focus areas. Because we have the infrastructure, because we have the people, because we have the capacity to do work outside of our primary focus, there is a strong inclination to pursue proposals, to pursue funding that may not necessarily sit within our core focus area. So the theory of change should really anchor the decisions that you're making as an organization, both in terms of your program design, but also in terms of the work that you're willing to go on and also the funding that you're pursuing. And the reason that I say this is having seen this gradual scope creep within organizations, where an organization starts out working with early childhood development, and then is suddenly working within basic education, working within school nutrition, and working in lots of different areas that were really outside of their core focus area. And what this does tend to do is, firstly, it dilutes the organization in terms of the expertise, because you're focused on lots of different things. But also what it does is it drives increasing competition within the sector. So we know there's always competition for funding. We work within a very competitive environment. So there is a strong incentive to allow that scope creep as we're pursuing other areas of funding. So really what we want to do is we want to ensure that the theory of change is something that kind of anchors what we do. So the theory of change, and there are a number of ways of going about the theory of change, and we'll share some of those additional guides after the session. But the theory of change really is a strategic document, and it's a visualization of the change that we're hoping to achieve. So we're looking to understand firstly of where are we now? So what is the context in which we're working? What is the challenge that we're seeing? And then where do we want to get to? So what is the change that we want to see? And the theory of change allows us to define what are the steps that we're taking to get from point A, which is where we are now, to point B, so where we want to get to. So let's just roll those through. Okay, so I always find it easiest to work through a specific example. So if we start at the base, and we're understanding the context in which we're working. As a youth organization, for example, we understand that there's poor education, there's high levels of poverty, there's a lack of support for young people, there's entrenched structural inequalities, there's high levels of vulnerability. So these are the things that we know, and ultimately this is what motivates us as an organization to drive an implementation to change that current context. So it means that young people are unemployed because they don't have the skills, access, and there's limited demand. So at this point, we know that we want to get young people into the economy. We want to make sure that they can contribute towards their communities, towards the broader economy, and join society as contributing members. So in order for us to do this, how do we get from a position where we have unemployed young people that have bad education, live in conditions of poverty, don't have any support, and are extremely vulnerable? Well, for us to do that, what we need to do is, as an organization, we may want to focus on, for example, providing training. So we want to provide training that then, if young people attend that training, then we're assuming that they will have improved skills. They will have improved skills that will then improve their self-esteem as well as their skills and increase the probability of them finding work. Similarly, if we provide information about opportunities to those youth, we're assuming that they will access those opportunities, and we're assuming that they can apply for those opportunities to then find secure work. Equally, we could provide transportation. So that transportation would then allow them to access those opportunities, to travel to a marketplace, to go for an interview, to then find or secure work. So if we look at this level, we're looking at the provision of training, the provision of information about opportunities, and the provision of transport. Those are the activities that we're engaging in. At an output level, we're then saying, what does that mean? Well, it means that young people attended the training. So we can count how many young people attended the training. At an outcome level, we then want to know whether or not they learned anything. So within that outcome layer, they would have improved their skills. And in order to do this, we want to be able to track what is that improvement in their understanding. And ultimately, this is where we're now extending into the impact level. We have a reduction in unemployment because youth are joining the economy as positive contributing members of society. Of course, there are a whole lot of external influencing factors that can positively or negatively impact on our success as an organization, and also the success of the young people that are making this journey from their current state of poor education, poverty, and inequality into a position where they're contributing members of society with viable income and viable earnings. And those might be things like, for example, a global recession. So what global recession is going to do is it's going to reduce the demand for labor. As an organization that focuses on training, information about opportunities and transportation to those opportunities, we're not going to be able to have any influence on a global recession. But that will certainly have an effect on our probability of success. So if there isn't as much demand, it doesn't matter how well we train young people, they're not likely to find employment because there just isn't that level of demand. So in looking at those sorts of factors, we need to then consider, as part of the results-based management process, as we're defining our program design, is to understand that if these are potential risks to the program, how are we going to mitigate? So how do we mitigate issues like recession? At a program level, we want to make sure that we're considering those risks to incorporate things like entrepreneurship, as an example, where we can create new kinds of demand that are not necessarily linked to traditional work or traditional jobs. So the theory of change really is what gives us a strategic anchor to both inform the work that we're doing, ensure that we're staying within our focus area, and also considering other areas that might assist us in designing the program. So if we need to do additional research on the context in which we're working, or those factors that influence the work that we're doing, this is what the process of defining a theory of change will do for us. So we'll be able to better articulate the work that we're doing, identify particular risks, make sure that we're clear on our assumptions. So the assumption that if young people attend a training, they will improve their skills. And if they improve those skills, then they'll be better positioned to find work. So we want to be able to use this theory of change process to better understand the work that we're doing, and also to be able to articulate the value that we're contributing. This is also where we are able to claim our contribution towards those broader impact level changes. Although we're not saying necessarily that we are the sole drivers of a reduction in youth unemployment. The research that is available across the board tells us that youth unemployment is an issue of supply, an issue of demand, and an issue of access or intermediation. So we know that if we improve the quality of supply, the probability of shifting unemployment is higher. Similarly, if we create new forms of demand for those youth, then we're likely to see a shift in those levels of unemployment. So the theory of change, as I said, is not just about an M&E function. It fits very well and quite importantly into the results-based management approach. We want to be able to use this as a tool to guide the work that we're doing, as well as to inform the monitoring and evaluation process. And generally, things like a theory of change is an activity that is best done with the organization collectively. Obviously, you can't have everyone participate in the process, but really important to have representation across the board. So if you have program managers, if you have your board members, if you have your executive, but equally you also want participation at a field worker level, for example, so that you can also draw on their insights around potential risks and mitigations when it comes to looking at the activities that you're defining, looking at the assumptions that you're making, and looking at really finding positive factors that would influence, and also identifying those negative factors or risks that might influence the implementation of the program. So just to note, my apologies if I don't respond to the chat. I'm toggling between multiple screens here, but we'll roll review, and I see that Ilona is jumping onto those questions as she can as well. Okay, so you'll often find alongside of a theory of change things like a logical framework. The logical framework, to a great extent, preceded the theory of change approach. And generally, the logical framework takes a more linear view in terms of project management. The log frames originated back in the 1960s. They were a planning approach that was used by the US military, which is probably why it seems quite rigid. It was then also adopted and propagated by USAID in the 60s for development projects. And since then has become a fairly standard approach that most funders or most partners will draw on when looking at articulating the process of implementation and then tracking the work that's being done. Just to note, we will revisit where the indicators and the targets sit in terms of the theory of change as we get to those indicators later on. Okay, so also to note that these there are a range of templates and guides that we'll link you to, that is hosted as part of the UNICEF Partners page. So there are a bunch of resources that we'll push out into that onto that site as well. Okay, so logical frameworks have become so prolific because they are relatively easy to use and relatively easy to understand, starting with the inputs, so the stuff that we use in order to do the activities. So inputs might be things like human resources, the people. A lot of it is focused around money because money pays for people and materials, but also your inputs might be a program design, so the idea or the IP around a particular implementation. Then we have the activities. Again, these are the things that we do. The day-to-day delivery from a program point of view. The outputs being the direct result of the things that we did. So in the case of a training session, the direct result or the output of a training session would be the number of people that attended that training session. As we then look at the outcomes, we're starting to understand, what does that mean? What is the change that was realized in the case of a training activity? What is the improvement of knowledge? And then as we get to that impact level data, we start to look at what is the contribution towards that longer term change. So IP is about, well, it can be implementing partner, but it is also intellectual property. So those ideas or the design of the program itself, yeah, it's generally not a UNICEF term. Implementing partners generally used with funding partners. So the long-term change, as we said, we always talk about the contribution towards that. So, for example, if we use the training example, if somebody has been through a training activity, they have greater understanding of that training activity. They would then need to apply that learning and that knowledge practically in terms of their day-to-day lives. So because we did a training activity on HIV around the use of prophylaxis, is that then firstly understood by the participants on that training? That's great, because we want to make sure that they do understand that. But whether or not that knowledge is going to be put into practice is a lot more difficult to track. So we're not going to know without undertaking a secondary and longitudinal study what is the use of prophylactics in as a mechanism for reducing HIV infection. What is the impact of that? So, as I said previously, the impact level data is extremely difficult to accumulate, to be able to track, to use, and also to be able to claim. But we certainly want to be able to refer to that impact level data to show where we're aligning our particular program activities and contributing towards that broader impact for a community or for our country or the society at large. So I think this gives a good representation of why we go to an impact level when it comes to M&E. As we extend further beyond the activity level, the attribution that we can claim as a result of the work that we've done becomes much more tenuous. So we can't necessarily claim a shift in the levels of HIV infection as a result of training about the use of condoms, for example. And certainly the variables and the complexity around doing monitoring and evaluation at that level increases exponentially. And certainly we'll see that for the most part, funders don't have the budget to facilitate monitoring and evaluation at an impact level, and often even at an outcome level. And we'll speak to this a bit more as we get to the financial considerations around implementation. But certainly the cost of monitoring and evaluation as we extend into the outcome and definitely into the impact level is substantial. So we need to be able to, first we need to understand that the high cost and time and effort required for monitoring and evaluation at that level, but also we need to be able to have those conversations with investment partners around the cost of showing that level of data. So then looking back at that template that we've got and articulating within the logical framework. So at an input level, what we would have is the money, the trainers, the content, the venue. The content would be that intellectual property, for example, that we would need to input. We would then need to apply some measures for that. So at an input level, we can count the number of rands, we can count the people that are involved, and we can count the content or the modules that are produced. At a means of verification level, we'd be able to check those things either in terms of financial statements or in terms of the staff registers and even the content in itself. So the risks and assumptions around this is that we're assuming that we need stuff to do training, and we can't do the training without these things. We need money, we need a venue. And of course, the risks around that might include things like the community not allowing us in to do the training. So as part of the definition of those risks and assumptions, as far as possible, we want to be able to articulate those in as much detail as possible. Activities, that's the training function itself. In order to verify that, we would think things like staff registers, for example, a venue contract or invoices. That would overflow then into the delivery of the training. And really, this is where most of the reporting happens, is at an output level. How many people attended the training? And for the most part, almost every project I've ever worked on includes things like attendance registers. And that's great for showing that the activity was undertaken and that the money was spent on what it said it was going to be spent on. But the risk is that, again, nobody listens, or the facilitators or the trainers are rubbish at what they do, or the material is not any good. So this is why we want to extend it to the outcome level, both in terms of being able to articulate the value that's being delivered and shifting understanding. So ideally, we want to know that young people attending a training session have learned something. And here we start to see more compound indicators. So the increase in knowledge, that percentage increase, we would need to know what was the starting point in understanding core concepts and what was the end point. And for this, the starting point or the pre-test is the baseline that we use. So the understanding of core concepts before we start the program of training gives us a baseline reference point. The post-test is what gives us the reference for the change that's happened. So what we want to do is then apply those tests, hopefully in a reliable way, for tracking that change. The risks of there, of course, is that somebody will cheat, somebody won't complete it honestly, and we won't get an effective view of what that increase in knowledge has been. So we're also assuming that the training will increase the knowledge or the skill in a particular area. And then the tenuous one, where we talk about the impact or the broader goals that we're looking to realize, is that the young person will be able to use that knowledge to get themselves a job, or to shift their behavior. And here we're looking at, again, at an impact level, the number of youth employed, the percentage change in employment broadly across a particular program. And there we might see particular placements or employment contracts. So yes, at an impact level, certainly from a broader NDP or SDG point of view, that successful access to gainful employment is subject to a whole range of variables outside of our particular activity focus. So there are lots of different things that are needed in order for a young person to be gainfully employed that may be well outside of our focus and certainly beyond what we can reliably claim or attribute to the training that was provided. Okay. And now the important thing that anchors all of these things, the log frame and the theory of change included, are the indicators. So indicators there are a range of different indicators that we're looking to understand. But broadly, the indicator is a qualitative or a quantitative factor or variable. Gives us a simple, reliable means to measure what we've done. Okay, so that definition is the official one, but really it's a way of us tracking the change, tracking the work that's been done. And again, you can have qualitative and quantitative measures, but ideally what we want to define from an indicator point of view are indicators that are specific, so focused and clear, measurable, quantifiable, and can reflect the change, attainable, so it's something that can actually be realized. Now, the attainability of indicators is a really interesting one, and often one that we see fairly consistently. As indicators are defined, organizations are tempted to refer to impact level indicators, which are certainly not attainable and certainly not measurable by the organization themselves. So it's important that the indicators that are defined can be attained through the delivery of the program and can be measured by the organization. Of course, the indicator has to be relevant and pertinent to the activity that's being undertaken, and also should be time-bound. So we can't say that from an indicator point of view, we're looking to improve the understanding of the role of condoms in reducing HIV infection, but we're not going to define any time to track that. So we're going to say we're going to test that over 10 years. The data or the indicator becomes largely irrelevant because it isn't time bound and specific to the work that we're doing. There are unfortunately a whole mess of different kinds of indicators that can be a point of confusion. So we talk about context, proxy, inputs, process, performance, progress, or results indicators. But for the most part, we won't need to worry about most of those because we're focused primarily on the process or performance indicators and then the progress or the results indicators. So those indicators that are showing how we're performing as an organization at a program level in delivering the work that we're delivering, and then also in terms of the results or the outcomes that we're realizing is what's happened as a result of the work that we're doing. And personally, what I tend to cluster these or organize these kinds of indicators around are firstly operational visibility, and secondly, strategic visibility. So the operational indicators are going to give us a view of what's happening on a day-to-day basis in terms of our delivery, specifically when it comes to the activities that are being undertaken. Ideally, as far as possible, those indicators should be based on data that is available in a really short period of time, if not in real time, so that we can make decisions to improve the operations, the delivery of our programs fairly rapidly. Operational visibility indicators that only surface 3 months down the line are not really valuable when it comes to being able to adapt after the fact. If we're funded for a particular window of implementation and we're getting performance indicators that are showing that we're really inefficient and not delivering as well as we should, 3 months down the line, it's a bit too late to make those changes. So ideally, when we look at those process or performance indicators, we want to ensure that they're based on data that is readily available on a relatively short period of time. That will give us a visibility of how things look on the ground as we're busy implementing. The results indicators, this is again where we're looking to show both a combination of the outputs, so the count of the attendance, for example, or the direct results of the activities themselves, and then also the change that we're realizing through those activities. And generally, as we start to extend into the output level data, we'll see that we have compound data sets, so things like percentage of or a ratio of. And generally at that level, we're tracking change from an outcome point of view, and that's best reflected through things like a comparison of one number to another. So for example, if we're looking at level of understanding, we would want to track the percentage improvement in the understanding around a particular concept. And in order for us to define that, we would need to have scores for participants before the session, and then we would need to compare that to scores of participants after the session. So if 50 participants didn't understand the concept before the session and only 25 of them didn't understand it after the session, it means that we've got that percentage improvement in understanding. So again, those indicators would then be composed of those core data sets of scores before and scores after. And this is also why at that results level, when we're talking about outcomes, we usually articulate those in things like a percentage of change. So based on the before and the performance after, this is what we can see in terms of that shift for the participants on our particular program. And then, of course, targets. So targets are really important, not just for funders as they're looking to ensure an effective return on their investment, but also from an organizational delivery point of view. If we don't aim at anything, we're going to hit it every time. So it's important that we're able to articulate what we want to realize. And those targets are based on our defined indicators, because we need to refer to something. If we want to target an increase or a decrease in particular measures, we need to have the base indicators in order to define our targets. Similarly, at an output level, we might have targets in terms of participation or in terms of reach. Again, we would need to define those indicators in advance before we start to then articulate what the targets might be for us to aim at, and also to mobilize our delivery against. Unfortunately, there is quite a bit of confusion around the definition of those targets, and the importance, of course, being that those targets are also achievable. So it's pointless to define a target that is well beyond the range or the capability of the organization. So we want to make sure that the targets that we're defining are firstly based on aligned with the indicators that we've defined, but also are realistic in what we're looking to achieve and can be achieved by the organization. And that's both in terms of managing expectations internally within the organization. So we're not setting targets that are going to demoralize and demotivate the team that is responsible for delivery, but also we want to ensure that we're managing the expectations of funders. Funders are likely to push, of course, for those the maximum targets. And if we don't have a process to show how we get to defining targets, and if we haven't gone through a process of defining a theory of change where we're articulating those factors that might positively or negatively influence us realizing those targets, we're going to be on the back foot when we have conversations with stakeholders around what is realistic and what is achievable in terms of those targets. So again, things like the theory of change are really important structures and processes to go through, so that we're able to effectively understand the context in which we're working, the work that we're going to be doing, but also then to ensure that we're equipped to have those conversations with other stakeholders when it comes to defining indicators and also defining the targets that we're looking to set. So before we move on, I'm just going to move back to the theory of change, because I wanted to just look at how we're positioning those indicators within the context of a theory of change. So at every level, what we're looking to do is to see where we can define specific indicators when it comes to outputs, and also when it comes to the outcomes as well. So, for example, when it comes to the baseline data, we know what poor education looks like. We've got national stats in terms of that education system and performance. Similarly, we've got stats around poverty, again, also for the likes of SDGs and Statistics South Africa or other statistical bodies. So we have some of that baseline impact level data. What we then would want to do is, as we're looking at providing training, we would need to know how many training activities are we going to run. So we're starting to track the work that we're doing. How many training sessions? How many people are involved? What is the cost of that training session? Again, these are the impact level indicators that would form part of things like a proposal that we're sending into a funding partner. At the output level, once we've done the activity of doing the training, we would want to then have an indicator that defines what is being achieved at that output level. So how many young people have attended that training? Then at an outcome level, we want to have an indicator that shows us the improvement in skills. So for us to be able to track that improvement in skills, we need generally 2 sets of data, a before and an after, so we can track that change. So the youth that have improved skills, we know that before they started the training, the score was X, and the score is now Y after the training. So there we can start to develop those indicators that show that positive change that we've realized through the activity. So the indicators then sit across all of these levels as we're defining the theory of change. Unfortunately, it's extremely difficult as we start to look at things like the the positive and negative factors that influence the results that we're able to achieve, because the impact of things like global recession, for example, will affect different areas in different ways. We know that it's likely to have an effect, but we can't necessarily measure that. So this is, again, why we are always reluctant to start looking at impact level indicators, because there are so many factors that we have no control over whatsoever. So the indicator function sits across both the theory of change and also the logical framework. I also wanted to highlight, while we're talking about the logical framework, and certainly in reference back to the way that UNICEF defines their results matrix, you'll see things like means of verification. So the means of verification is an important part, both because we need the core data that is generated through the means of verification, so things like an attendance register, to inform the indicators. So if we're tracking output level data in terms of who's attended a program, we need those registers to be able to count how many people were there, but also we need to retain those means of verification. So the means of verification, certainly at a reporting or at a funder level, are how we're going to prove that we've done what we said we were going to do. So the means of verification are an important component. Certainly it feeds the indicator sets through, it provides the base data. Again, these are the means of verification of the monitoring functions that we would use. But also important that we're able to manage that means of verification and also be able to supply that means of verification as and when we need to validate our claimed results, but also to provide comfort to funders. So that means of verification sits very much within the function of monitoring. And although that might include things like hard copy attendance registers, it could include other digital tools and data sets that are captured and managed through a piece of technology. Okay, so I think we're about due for another caffeine fix, or at least a comfort break. But what I wanted to do before then is to then take some questions before we go to break. And then we'll come back after some coffee. So I just wanted to pause there and see if there are any questions from anyone about the theory of change, logical framework, and also in particular the indicators. So I know the indicators are some consistently an area of concern for many organizations. So if you want to have a specific question, I know Ilana has been jumping on those as we've seen them in the chat. But if you have specific questions around any of those functions, feel free to raise your hand. So I see this. So go ahead. Go ahead, Dennis. Do you want to go ahead, Dennis?
Yes, thank you. I wanted you to comment about qualitative targets. How do we set qualitative targets? And then how do we set determine qualitative indicators? Thank you. Because most of the time we are talking about quantitative.
Great. Yeah. Thanks, Dennis. That's a great question. And generally, what we're talking about from a qualitative measure point of view is what we would consider an outcome level indicator, where we're looking at tracking change or using that data as reflection on the quality of the work that we're doing. So qualitative measures would be reflected in terms of that shift in, for example, knowledge when it comes to training. So that would give us a view of how good our training is. So that qualitative measures are usually compound through a number of different data sets to give us a percentage-based view of change. But there are a range of qualitative functions that would need to be reduced to a quantitative value. So qualitative and quantitative research is often where that comes from. Qualitative research always much more difficult to do, and often would involve things like thematic analysis. Ultimately, for us to be able to define indicators, we would need to be able to reduce qualitative data into qualitative data. Sorry, the other way around. Quantitative into quantitative data. So where we talk about how you feel about something, that's not something that's immediately quantitative. We can't count how you feel about something, but we can reduce that qualitative value into a quantitative score. So instead of asking you how you feel about something, we would ask you to grade your feelings on a scale. So when it comes to indicators, we're looking at converting that qualitative response into a quantitative value. If we're talking about qualitative values, it's still based on a data point or a data measure, but it reflects then on the quality of the work or the quality of the outcome that's being done. But in order for us to get to any level of indicator, we have to reduce a qualitative value into a quantitative value. Does that help, or am I making it murkier for you? Dennis?
Yes, I'm comfortable. I'm fine. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, great. So, I mean, generally, when it comes to reporting, qualitative reports would include specifically the narrative component. And generally, with monitoring and evaluation, it's not something that is easily incorporated into monitoring and evaluation function from an indicator point of view. We always recommend a qualitative component, and that qualitative component generally looking at narrative. So capturing the stories around the data that's being collected. And certainly when it comes to the reporting function, we see monitoring and evaluation traditionally as providing the hard outline of the picture. So if you're drawing a picture, the M&E data gives you a picture of the outline, a clearer view of here are the black and white lines around the work that we've been doing. What the narratives do, what the qualitative data does, is it gives us the color. So it gives us the stories of the people that we're working with, stories around the value that's being delivered. And ultimately, for an effective report, you need both. Because from an investor point of view, from a stakeholder point of view outside of the organization, that picture is going to allow the stakeholder to connect with the work that you're doing. The M&E, the hard lines, and the core data gives you the comfort around the fact that the organization is implementing effectively and efficiently. But the stories, the qualitative data is what's going to give the color, what's going to bring the individual perspectives into those kind of reports. And certainly when it comes to communicating with stakeholders outside of the organization, where they may not have the day-to-day experience of working with implementation and understanding the value of the work that's being done, those stories, those narratives, that qualitative data is really important for fleshing out and providing a full picture of the work that's being delivered by the organization. Thanks. Let's see. Gabriel, you had a question?
Good day, Jason. Yes. Jason, most of the time we get confused about these indicators. For instance, the DREAMS programs steady state that we're required to have girls between the ages of 18 to 24.
Mm-hmm.
And when you go on site and you check the register, there is a girl of which is 24, but she'll be 25 in the next 4 months' time. And the programs runs for about 18 months. Now, because of this indicator stated that we need to have girls for 18 to 24, what do you do now with these girls who are going to be 25 in 4 months' time?
So I think this is also where the the documentation around the theory of change becomes important, and also making sure that you're articulating the assumptions and also the risks. So when you come to those sorts of kind of time-based projects that would potentially show the kind of progression out of a targeted age range, as a program officer, firstly, you would need to manage the expectations around the funder, but also then ensure that you're articulating that the participation is defined at the point of registration. And the fact that somebody would extend beyond that age range over time, as long as you're communicating that in advance with the funder, with the investing partner, and they're clear on that, then there shouldn't be an issue in terms of that that shift of the participant out of the target range over time. But again, this is why we need to have those clearly defined assumptions and risks at the outset, so that we can have the conversation with our stakeholders in advance to get an agreed view of, this is what we would define as a participant within the program, somebody that is 24 at the point of registration, regardless of the fact that they would cycle out to be 25 and outside of the range of the scope of the focus. If they would, if the funder or the partner is not happy with that, then you would need to again update that and ensure that there's a flow down into the programs team to ensure that when they're registering someone, we know that the cutoff then is 23 and a half years old. Otherwise, we can't incorporate you into the program. So again, I think it's firstly about making sure that everyone understands what are the risks and what are the assumptions that we're making, then communicating that effectively with the funding partner to make sure that they are happy with the point of the indicated definition around age. And if not, then there needs to be a flow down into the programs team to say, we can only work with girls up to the age of 23 years and 6 months, because they still need to be under the age of 25 by the time the program ends. So that's how I would manage those constraints around a defined indicator set in terms of age groupings. Does that help there, Gabriel?
No, thank you very much. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Great. So I'm just checking if there are any other questions in the chat there. So yeah, so just in terms of log frame and theory of change, the funny thing is that if you look at a logical framework and you take what we've defined as the inputs, the activities, the outputs, the outcomes, and the impact, and you kind of turn it on its side, it's similar in many ways to what a logical framework looks like, obviously excluding the context and the starting point, and then the impact is there already. So generally, you would include both of those, whether you use a visualization of the likes of a theory of change or a logical framework to, as Alona said, make it more concrete in terms of those definitions. Generally, I would use both. So I would use the theory of change at an organizational level. The theory of change should be something that anchors the organization, as I said. As we look at individual programs, we would make sure that the theory of change for the program fits within the theory of change for the organization. Again, looking to articulate and show the flow of attribution from where we're starting to where we want to get to. But again, the logical framework is a project management tool. So we would then potentially look at using a logical framework to articulate, these are the inputs that we're specifying, these are the activities that we're going to do, and this is what we expect to see in terms of the outcomes and the outputs. Okay, great. Any other questions from anyone at this stage? No questions. Fantastic. I'm making this all up as I go along. Could be complete rubbish, so we're going to have to do a test on the qualitative side of this session a bit later on. Right. Okay, well, I think maybe it's just about getting some more caffeine in everyone and getting a bathroom break. As I said, what we will do as well, we'll have some time at the end of the session to answer specific questions. Also, what we want to do is to see if we can take some specific examples. We'll also talk through things like the results matrix as part of the UNICEF program documentation process and onboarding partners, because that'll also make it quite specific when it comes to how we're applying these as we're working with a key partner like UNICEF that's funding specific implementation. So we will get to all of those. And yeah, I think let's take a break, and we'll then jump back in. I think let's take a 15-minute coffee break. So if we could all be back by 25 minutes past 12. Yeah, I'm going to go and make up some new things about monitoring and evaluation, get some coffee, and we'll see you guys back in about 15 minutes. Thanks, everyone.
Now she's I hope it's like what? She's big.
Je me propose to get already.
And that's why online was better than what I just know something like 3 years ago. Or 3 years ago.
Approach
Has everyone got their fix on caffeine? I hope I spent the time making up news and interesting things about monitoring and evaluation. And just reinventing what we're going to talk about next, which is the implementation of our monitoring and evaluation. But before we jump into that, I just want to check again if there are any other questions that came up as you were thinking about the indicator sets and questions that you might have around indicators and theories of change and logical frameworks. Any questions or comments? No, great. Okay, perfect. I can continue to spurt forth misinformation and things that I've made up in the shower. Okay, so implementation, I think, is probably the most important and the most difficult. It's certainly something we're quite good at, is putting the plans down on paper. But when it comes to converting that into action, it becomes a little bit trickier. So generally what we would see within the monitoring and evaluation function, certainly within the RBM process, we've got the planning process, and then we need to run through the implementation. So converting what we've done in planning into implementation. And this is a really important step because it's where we take the documents that we've compiled as part of the theory of change, as part of the logical framework, and start to convert it into a document that will guide the work that we're going to do for monitoring and evaluation on the ground. So for us, it generally includes a number of different things. As we know, based on what we discussed earlier, monitoring and evaluation is not just about the monitoring and evaluation officer that often sits in the dark corner in the office and swims through paper. And whenever there's a funder report due, he's the one that, or she's the one that panics and has to try and pull all of the paperwork together to submit a report. Really, monitoring and evaluation is an organization-wide function. And this is why we talk about results-based management and not just M&E, because we want it to be embedded into everything that the organization does so that we can make more effective decisions based on the data that we have. So monitoring and evaluation planning includes both your human resources, so the team that's involved in implementation, the team that's involved in your operational management, as well as their skills in being able to collect and manage the data, but also then to draw the necessary insights to give operational and strategic visibility. M&E planning also includes the processes and the policies that we apply, because in order for us to manage ongoing monitoring, we need a process for that data collection. We need a process for the review of the data. We need a process for unpacking the learnings and adapting the work that we're doing. Then, of course, we need various tools to manage the data that we're collecting. And often now we talk about the technology tooling. So a tool, for example, may just be a simple survey or a form that's collected, either in hard copy or in soft copy. But increasingly, we're seeing a number of technology tools that can be used to streamline and improve that process. And then, of course, there's the money and of course, the money. Because, as I said, monitoring and evaluation is not a cheap undertaking. It's something that does require the allocation of financial resources, because we need people, because we need tools, and we need to be able to manage that data once we've got it. So the monitoring and evaluation plan ideally incorporates all of those components in articulating how we're going to take the theory of change, how we're going to take our logical framework, and how we're going to convert that into an active process across the organization and manage that on an ongoing basis. So first and foremost, when we talk about the the teams and the participation of different stakeholders across the board. We would generally have those members of the organization that are responsible for the capture of the data to support the monitoring process. They may be responsible for the data management as well, but then we're going to need someone that's going to analyze the data so that we can draw those insights from the data that we're collecting. You might also have a QA role, so quality assurance. Certainly when there's the consolidation of data, there's perhaps data capture if you're still using paper-based processes. Important to have a quality assurance function that can check how well that work is being done. Within any function of insights or intelligence, if you put rubbish in, you're going to get rubbish out. So the quality of the data is really important when it comes to reliable reporting and being able to understand what the data is telling us. So that QA role sits above the data capture function and is responsible for maintaining and managing the quality of the data that is incorporated into any reporting function. The analysis and data management generally sits as a combined role. Once the data has been captured and consolidated, it's then that we're going to do the analysis and the evaluation. So that analysis function, again, drawing insights, somebody that has an understanding of the program, that participated in the theory of change definition, understands the design and the intention of the program, to be able to draw insights and perhaps also to be able to consolidate and define the indicator values. So again, if we're looking at core data or raw data from a score as a pre-test, and then comparing that to a score of a post-test, this analyst function would then be able to consolidate that into an indicator of percentage of improvement or change that is realized through the particular program. There may also be a reporting function. Generally, this is linked to things like marketing or packaging for graphics and things like design. So being able to present the insights that have been drawn, it's often necessary to draw on somebody that has skills in presenting that data, those insights, in a way that is consumable to different stakeholders. So presenting a spreadsheet with a whole lot of data is not going to be well received, certainly at a board level, and unlikely at an investment partner level. So what we want to be able to do is to package those insights that we've drawn from the monitoring and evaluation process. The reporting role and the packaging function would also then involve drawing on specific stories, those narratives that we spoke about earlier, so that we can give a better picture, we can paint a better picture for those stakeholders, both so that they can see the value that we've delivered, the hard data, but also when it comes to the telling the stories of the value that's being delivered to those clients or beneficiaries that we're serving. And then also action and planning roles. Again, you'll see how this ties into the results-based management process, is what are we going to do now that we have these insights? What are we going to do with the data? How are we going to change what we're doing? How are we going to continue what we're doing? You'll see that some of these functions will spread across a management level or an executive level down into program or operational levels. You may also have some of the operational roles that fulfill some of these functions, certainly in terms of analysis and data management, that's held within the operational level and not so much at the programs level. But what is really important is that monitoring and evaluation is a shared responsibility. It's not something that can be held entirely by an M&E person within the office. Their role is ideally to coordinate and oversee that function to ensure that the planning components, the theory of change, the results matrix, the logical framework, the indicators, the data, that the tools are being used effectively by other members of the organization. So their role is really to oversee the function and to ensure that there is consistent alignment, to ensure that the quality of the data and the insights is maintained, and to ensure that the story is being told in the best possible way to reflect the value that's being delivered by the organization. We'll also touch on the packaging function as we get to the broader value that monitoring and evaluation should deliver for the organization. But as we then look at the key component of the monitoring and evaluation plan, which is defining out the process. And as I said, generally, this is where we start with the theory of change. The theory of change defining that current state, where we want to get to and how we're going to get there, what are the assumptions that we're making, what are the potential risks, and then also what is the broader view for the delivery, and how we're going to mitigate against potential negative factors that put the implementation at risk. Once we've done the theory of change, the next step would be for us to define the indicators. And the theory of change would assist us with this. You may also apply a logical framework within the theory of change, so that as you're starting to concretize those inputs, those outputs, also then defining how we're going to measure at each level. So at an output level, how are we going to track the performance? Are we going to count the number of participants? At an outcome level, again, how are we going to track that change? Do we have a mechanism for a pre-test and a post-test? So we want to use the theory of change and then the logical framework, if we're using one off of the theory of change, to then define the indicators so that we've got an idea of what we need to track, because that will then inform our monitoring plan. So this is where we're defining how we're going to collect the data that will reliably inform the indicators that we're reporting as results. The monitoring plan also will incorporate things like the means of verification if necessary. Do we need to include those different data points to be able to verify? So it would also include things like the tools that we're going to use for collecting the data, whether those be hard copy paper forms or digital tools like online forms or mobile data collection tools. Within that monitoring plan, we want to be able to articulate, these are the tools, this is how we're going to collect the data, this is when we're going to collect the data, and then ultimately this is how the data is going to be managed as well once it has been collected. We'll touch on the policy link to that as well, but the monitoring plan is really all about the core data that we're collecting. And then an evaluation plan. So this is also talking about how we're going to analyze and interpret the data. This doesn't necessarily need to be a standalone document. It can be appended to the monitoring plan. Really what we're looking to do is to break down how we're going to consolidate and analyze the data, and understand what our performance looks like, either operationally or at the strategic level, in terms of realizing those objectives from an efficiency and effectiveness point of view. So these sorts of structures are really important when it comes to managing continuity within the organization as well. And although it may seem fairly common sense for us to understand what we're going to do to analyze, it's a really useful document to have in place for us to ensure continuity, and also to ensure that members or participants within the organization that move in and out of a role have something to use to guide the work that they're responsible for. And the same is the case when it comes to the final step, which is the action plan. So how we're going to use the data, whether this be reporting or informing functions of operational delivery. The action plan would also then define potential workflows. So what happens when the data is received, the insights are processed, and we find this. So this is also where you would perhaps include the if-then statements. If this happens, then do that. So the action plan is really a guiding document that can help us to, again, manage continuity, ensure that we've got a clear idea of roles and responsibilities and who's doing what and what they have to do based on the data that we're seeing. In some cases, this might be a fairly passive process. So we're saying we're going to use this to consolidate a report. This is what the report should look like. This is where the report goes to. and potentially these are the dates that we need to provide the reports by. Reporting timelines, as our friends at UNICEF will know, are extremely difficult. Implementing partners are often not able to articulate the factors that impact on them being able to deliver reports, so that those timelines are, or those deadlines are often missed. So there's some tension between different stakeholders. So having an action plan with defined timelines within that action plan will help to navigate through the relationship with different stakeholders, like investors. And again, that's also where the assumptions and risks would come in. We would need to be able to say these are some of the things within theory of change that would either positively or negatively impact on our ability to report on those results. So within the action plan, we want to make sure that we're able to articulate what data is required by whom, who is responsible for that, when does it need to get to them, and also then what do they do once they have it. As I said, it may be a passive process of reporting, or it may trigger additional functions like programmatic changes, additional learning and training by the team that's working on the ground, or operational changes in terms of how we're delivering the program. I'm just going to pause there. I see there's a hand. Nadine, did you want to ask a specific question there?
If I may, please, it's linked to your previous slide around teams and skill, or team and skills. And my question is, I work in an organization where our team began with zero M&E or research capacity and understanding. And so over the last 4 years, I've managed to help people to understand key concepts, etc. But what that means, and I suspect, so I'm happy for you, even though you don't know me, to be quite critical of my work, is the 5 roles that you capture on the slide. I find, as I was reflecting on it, that all of us are in fact performing all of those roles, but in slightly different ways. So I oversee all of it, but I capture data, I quality assure, I'm involved in analysis and data management. I report, but the rest of the team also reports at a different level. So they report to schools, I report to our funders. And in terms of action and planning roles, we are all, because we have, I adopt a fairly consultative leadership style, so everyone's involved in that as well. The negative aspect, I think, is that it becomes quite overwhelming. So right at the beginning, one of my, when you asked about expectations, I'm wondering whether my process, in the way I've mapped it, is over-inclusive and therefore needs to be simplified, but not to lose depth, quality, and rigor. And that's kind of where I'm caught at the moment, is trying to understand how to not overwhelm the team when they're also having to actually roll out the intervention. But without the input, I feel I'm making so many assumptions about my own capacity to grasp it all. So yeah, I've said a lot, but I'm wondering if you have some thoughts around that.
Yes, I do, and thank you. I really appreciate the question, because I think it's a frustration that many organizations face, and often it's one that's linked to resourcing. So many organizations do not have the resourcing to appoint somebody into those specific roles. And certainly it's one of the reasons that we say it's a responsibility that's shared across the organization. And if you're fortunate enough to have an M&E officer that can oversee and manage the process, then that's great. Generally, we do follow within the social sector a very participatory and inclusive process. As you pointed out, it is about picking points at which you want to drive that inclusion and get those viewpoints in without it being overwhelming. So generally what we would do is we would run that as far as possible, a really inclusive process as part of the theory of change. When it comes to the understanding broadly across the organization of, why are we doing what we're doing? what is it that we're doing, and what are we hoping to achieve, that sort of buy-in is really important. So, running a theory of change process, really useful, as I said, from a strategic point of view, to get buy-in across the organization, but also to get inputs around potential risks and the assumptions that we're making in working with different communities. So that is where I would focus my inclusion. But then following on from that, ideally what you want to do is to leverage that experience to then define and manage your planning process for implementation. So in looking at things like the monitoring plan, okay, who is going to be responsible for this? We don't have a dedicated person, so who is going to be responsible for what data? And remember, this is why we're collecting the data. We were all part of the theory of change discussion, so everyone understands why they are collecting the data. And that understanding of why we're doing things around data, which is obviously on top of the actual program implementation, is really important to improve the quality of the data. So if your team members understand the value of the data that they have to collect, often grudgingly, is on top of the core program delivery, they're a lot more likely to pay attention to the data that's being captured. So again, if you start with the theory of change and get buy-in and understanding for the importance of the monitoring and evaluation process, both in terms of tracking how well you're able to implement, but also what that implementation means. And even when it comes to being able to continue to raise the funding that pays the bills, that's a really important part to be participatory and inclusive. But once you get to the planning around implementation and the actions off of that, this is where we want to rely on as detailed a documentation as possible. So within a business environment, what generally you would talk about are systems of delivery. And systems of delivery would be in place when it comes to finance, when it comes to sales, when it comes to marketing, when it comes to operations. And the systems of delivery allow you to achieve some flexibility in terms of different members of the team fulfilling different functions, because it gives them a guideline of what they have to do. And the same is true when it comes to monitoring and evaluation. We want to have a system of delivery defined so that we know, okay, what do I have to do for monitoring? Okay, these are the things that I need to do. This is when I need to have it by. This is the tool that I need to use. This is then who it needs to go to. And then they need to do this with that data or these insights. They need to then compile, they need to communicate, they need to package the data that we're collecting. So the documentation and the planning around the implementation of monitoring and evaluation, it's really important to have those document structures in place. Not that they should be overwhelming, so you don't want a 50-page Bible. As far as possible, you want something that's easy to follow, whether it be a checklist or a step-by-step process that's easy to understand and easy to access without rolling narratives and explanations. You want something that is really accessible for somebody that is fulfilling that function, whether it's their dedicated role or on top of or alongside of other things that they do. So really, just to reiterate, theory of change is where you want to drive inclusion and participation. Within the definition of those documents, you want to involve key people that are responsible and that can help you to define those documents. But those documents should then help you to anchor the process once you've done the preliminary theory of change, so that everyone buys in and they've got a clear view of what steps to follow when it comes to doing the work that's above and beyond their existing work. Does that help?
It does. It's very helpful. It's also very affirming because what you're describing is what we've put in place. I will need to revisit the aspect which I spoke of earlier, and I'll listen as we go further to how to streamline, because like I said, I suspect my style is over inclusive, and perhaps I'm not needing to collect as much data as I'm collecting. That's my biggest worry.
Yeah,
But thanks,
look,
thanks.
the data person in me says collect as much data as you can, but the pragmatist in me says because I mean it's it's if you've got the data, then you've got the data. If you don't use the data, that's great. Or it's not ideal. But if you don't have the data and you do need the data and you haven't got the data, you can't go and get the data after the fact. So it is a balance because, as we know and we'll speak about now, it's expensive. Monitoring and evaluation is an expensive undertaking. Inevitably, there's costs associated with obviously the people that are responsible for it, but also things like the paper, the transportation, the systems, the management of the data, the cleaning of the data. So it is an intensive process. So the balance in terms of collecting data that you need versus collecting data that you might not need, but you think you might, or you may be, or it's again around the resourcing. So start with what is core and what is essential, and that should be guided by your theory of change and your logical framework and the indicators, and everything else is really color to the picture. Nice to have, but if you don't have the resourcing, then don't do it. So I mean, I think that's the difficulty is in drawing that line. You definitely don't want to be collecting more data than you absolutely have to. Because of the cost and the effort associated with, and in particular when it comes to members of your team, it's exhausting. Anybody that's had to collect data and fill in forms and all the rest, it's generally not fun for most people. So we want to reduce it and make it as easy as possible, just so that we can, obviously maintain the quality of the data. Getting buy-in and understanding of the value of that process is a really important step. But that said, we still want to make sure that we're not wasting time collecting data that's not necessarily going to add value to our operational visibility or our strategic visibility. That strategic visibility, and we'll come to that in a bit, is also around being able to tell the story about the organization and the value that's being delivered. But yeah, the resourcing for monitoring and evaluation, it's a problem. And I love these sessions because I get to get on a soapbox and shout about including line items for monitoring and evaluation. I can't tell you how many proposals I've seen with no allocation of budget towards monitoring and evaluation, or either on the implementing partner side or on the funder side. So if any proposal or any terms of reference or call for proposals doesn't include a line item for monitoring and evaluation, I get very worried. Unfortunately, often what that means is bad news for implementing partners, because the expectation is still that you're going to be able to provide data, to provide reports, but it's not costed anywhere. So this means that you are absorbing that cost into your overhead that's unfunded. And of course, everyone knows that civil society organizations always have lots of money, so they can easily absorb that cost, right? No, we don't have that money. We don't have the ability to absorb costs that haven't been factored into the delivery. So it's really important that we're considering the cost of our monitoring and evaluation. And that cost is linked to the human resources, the time that it takes to collect the data, to monitor the delivery of the program. It's also about the tools that we're using. A piece of paper costs money. Printing costs money. Transporting those documents costs money. Recovering those documents costs money. Capturing into a system costs money. Managing the system costs money. Being able to report and make pretty pictures, those things cost money. So it's really important as we look at the cost of monitoring and evaluation that you're able to very clearly see what it's costing you. Over the past 10, 15 years or so, we've worked a lot with technologies, mobile data collection, web-based data collection, custom bespoke tools. And one of the biggest conversations that we always have to have in trying to justify the cost of a system is the fact that partners, whether they be implementing partners or funding partners, have no idea what monitoring and evaluation currently costs them, But if you propose a system that has a very clear and identifiable cost, the first answer is no, that's too expensive. But there's no point of reference. So many organizations have no idea what it's costing them to do monitoring and evaluation. So when thinking about any implementation, that cost becomes really important. And also, once you know what it costs you to do monitoring and evaluation, if you're doing it manually, the cost of that paper, that transportation, that printing, that data capture, you can then make objective decisions about selecting other tools that might be available, especially where those tools have a cost attached to them. So rather than being able to just dismiss them offhand, we can't afford that mobile tool because it's too expensive. A lot of those sorts of statements are based on zero knowledge or zero data. We just see a specific number and we have no idea of what traditional monitoring costs us. So we just say no. But we'll get to that as well when you start talking about the technology. But really important, just to reiterate, is to include the cost of monitoring and evaluation. Every single funding proposal that you'll ever have to submit will require reporting, will require data, will require that you show how the investment is going to be used. And to be able to generate that data will cost money. So it's important to be able to have those conversations with your investment partners or other stakeholders. So there's a very clear understanding of where that item comes and what it should be. The values would vary in terms of a percentage based on top of the total program cost. Generally, if you're aggressive around monitoring and evaluation, that would start at about 10% of the total project cost. But at that level, we would expect outcome level data. So it would involve the tracking of indicators at an outcome level where we're showing that specific change. It costs more to develop data at an outcome level because we would need to do things like pre-tests and post-tests or baselines and summative evaluations. So it's much more expensive. If you're just reporting at an output level, so you want us to count and report on the number of participants or the activity-based data, then that cost is significantly lower. So that would then run between 3 and 5%, depending on the complexity of the project. But again, these are important discussions to be able to have with investment partners. And if you don't have any idea of what those costs are, then you're not going to be well equipped to have those discussions. But it's definitely something that has to be done more. So I know certainly Ilona and the UNICEF team are fairly aggressive at driving that line item within the budgeting, but often it can be forgotten. Certainly in trying to get a detailed breakdown of what it costs to deliver, that monitoring and evaluation is also the thing that gets cut first. And many organizations say, well, it's easy enough to do, it's just a few forms. So if you don't know what it's going to cost you, you can't really make those decisions. It's like anything, coming back to the RBM methodology, you have to have the data to make the right decision. Okay, I'll get off the soapbox now around the